And on the phone, it is always a pleasure to welcome to the program the blogger Digby from the. I call it an Uber blog because it almost feeds directly into my brain. It's like an extra RSS feed. Of course, I'm talking about Hullabaloo at digbysblog.blogspot.com. Welcome back, Digby.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
It's interesting, how I know just how someone with so much money, like Ann Romney, can just not even realize that she's rich.
Well, this is the delusion of the American, one percenters, or in their case, the 0.1 percenters. I mean, they're way up there. They believe they're middle class. I don't know where this comes from. I guess it's the idea that somehow they all think they're Ward and June Cleaver, and they're living in a suburb somewhere, and their mansions, not even McMansions, are the way everybody lives, and that's just normal. I mean, hear this all the time. This past week, we heard a bunch of whining from Wall Street investment types who are crying that they're not getting their bonuses because the lament was, unless you have money, you just don't know how hard this is.
It's true. It is definitely true. I think that, as an experiment, maybe they should just lend us that money interest-free and maybe just gift it to us just for like 6 weeks so we could all suffer.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to run that experiment. Just let me have that money and I will report back.
I think Ann Romney must look at Mitt's jeans and just go, these are denim like everybody else's. They're not gold laced. Don't you? We don't. But we're not talking about. It's just amazing to me because I think it's exponentially that much more diluted because. They don't even have the capacity to realize how offensive what they're saying is. Like, just sort of like their number one goal, the only thing they wake up in the morning now and probably have done for the past 5 or 6 years, maybe longer, is just how can we project that we feel the pain of Americans? And they can't even do that. It's stunning. Maybe they're just that honest, I guess.
I think, it speaks to his authenticity. People give him a lot of grief for having no core, for being an empty suit. But, this is him, and he can't help it no matter what, no matter how absurd it is. He can't stop himself from speaking the truth, which is that, he's a rich he and his wife, apparently. I didn't know this about her until this, but, apparently it's both of them are just completely out of touch, wealthy people who are living under some illusion that that's the way everybody else lives. And it says everything about him as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I don't need to know anymore. The guy is deluded.
I've referenced this a couple of times on the program, and I want to move on to this other topic. But before we do, I just remember, and it resonated for me so much because it really was a sort of I had an epiphany about politics back when Dukakis couldn't beat George Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, here's Mike Dukakis, a guy who literally shoveled the snow off his walk. It's not such a big deal, but here's a guy who understood what it was to just sort of live a fairly a typical life in terms of his economic situation. And I just remember they brought out George Herbert Walker's Bush's sister to explain how he was an average guy. And the quote was something to the effect of like, we had such a normal upbringing. If we left our tennis rackets out in the rain, we got punished. And I just thought they would walk off their court in their backyard and leave the tennis rackets there. And if they didn't bring them in, they would get punished just like everybody else. And this guy's got that same disease. I mean, I guess that's one of the beautiful things about being rich is that you never, ever get reminded that you're rich if you hang out with enough other rich people.
Well, compared to many of his friends, he probably isn't. I mean, compared to the donors to his super PAC, he's poor.
That's
probably true. He's not
true.
A billionaire. I mean, geez, he's suffering.
Yes, I only have, there's only like 7 zeros after my net worth.
I know, I'm a failure. I mean,
All right, but let's tack over because this has been, I think, well, you write in this piece that you did about the 16 percenters, which is based on a piece in the Daily Beast, that for whatever reason, and we can imagine what those reasons are, but despite the fact that women have achieved not parity, but have achieved great gains in entering into the workforce, they still get paid less money for the same job. I think somewhere around 75 to 80% of what a comparable job would be. But women are incredibly underrepresented in leadership positions. And this is indicative of sort of a plateauing. And I think what we're experiencing in this country, a backlash against women's economic emancipation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been kind of wondering about this for a while because, I grew up, with the women's movement. And basically, with the promise, I understood, the argument always was that, well, it's going to take time for women to reach, a level of parity with men because they don't have the education experience, everything in the workplace. They're going to have to get that. So my generation was going to grow into that, and probably the one coming up behind me would be there for them. Because obviously you go to college, you get the education, you work your whole life, theoretically you should be able to gain the experience necessary in these various fields. And it's not happening. I mean, I'm old now, and it's not happening. And we're at 16%, and we're way behind other Western democracies in America. Our exceptionalism is showing itself in this particular way. And, there's really no reason for it. I mean, women are educated, they are emancipated, they are, free in most ways to pursue their dreams. Many of them are, and they're just not getting there. And there are many reasons for it. Some of it, you can see articulated by such wonderful, highly paid leaders as Rush Limbaugh. And you can see it in other more subtle ways in which we continue to be unable to develop institutions and structures that allow for both family and work to be, reasonably dealt with through our, various systems of workplace laws and government edicts. So, we're stuck, and I continue to see signs that we're actually sliding back, which is very disturbing. I mean, it's one thing to stall out for a while. It's another to actually backslide. And what you're seeing with the assault on reproductive rights is that backslide. And that's kind of at the center of the whole thing. Without that, women literally cannot be free to, to pursue their lives as full human beings. They just can't. They have to be able to control their reproduction. And we all thought that was pretty well settled. And it was great. Science had come along and solved this problem, allowed women to be women, but also allowed them to be fully involved in in every aspect of life outside the home. And now we're seeing, what I see is a really severe attack. Since 2010, there have been more than 1,000 laws put forth in the states and some in Congress as well to restrict women's reproductive rights. And we've seen these attacks on Planned Parenthood and, everything that we've seen happen in the last few weeks with this new strategy that they have about, religious freedom or religious liberty, they're calling it. So, this is happening. It's not just a figment of, paranoid feminist imaginations. It's happening before our eyes. And I think it's something that maybe women are beginning to wake up to. I've seen it for a while. I mean, I think other people have been observing some of this strange phenomenon. And now it's kind of coming to the fore. And thanks to Rush Limbaugh, and various other foolish people like, Komen for the Cure and others who were succumbing to this pressure, at the very least we seem to be waging the battle. Whether we win, I don't know, but at least it's joined,
Well, I think the in some respects, I mean, the wonderful thing, to the extent that one can characterize it this way, about Limbaugh is that he basically ripped the veneer off of this attack on women. In other words, I think that there's a tendency when you see things like personhood amendments, when you see things like in Virginia a transvaginal, a medical rape essentially. In the event that women want to exercise a right that the Supreme Court has deemed to be constitutional. Um, when you see these things, I think the first tendency is to sort of say, like, well, this is sort of like the white knuckled grip of religious fervor. But I think when Limbaugh comes out there and starts talking about this has nothing to do with starts characterizing women who take contraception as sluts. I think it really then exposes that this is, I think, even beyond sort of like I guess like an emotional misogyny. But I mean, you really do see that thing that Corey Robin talks about. This is a reaction to, I think, sort of the financial emancipation of women. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, I think like there's a tendency that we say like, oh, we're seeing these things strictly because of religious values. But I don't think that there is an increase
no.
in religious values in this country that are trying to subjugate women. I actually think on some level, what we're seeing is that, particularly in a time of economic stress, that women are taking their share of the blame for entering the workforce.
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, no, this isn't just a religious backlash. I mean, I don't think, is Rush Limbaugh a religious guy? I mean, it sure doesn't strike me that way.
No, of course.
I mean, I don't think he is, and I don't think that whole side, that whole faction, the sort of Rush Limbaugh, misogynist faction, that doesn't come from religion. That comes from a sense of loss of control, and that's exactly what Corey Robin was talking about, was that this reaction to, as he puts it, the family, the factory, and the field, which is these private realms of power that, are the most important to conservatives, or reactionaries, as he calls them. That this is when threats to that become acute, is when they react, and I think that I think that what's happened is, I mean, you have to look at this. I mean, in the great span of history, women's rights, women coming into the workforce, birth control is one of the most sociologically significant events in human history. It's big. It's huge. It's unbelievable. I mean, we sort of have been living in this very, in this amazing world where all this stuff was kind of falling away and we took it for granted. But when you look at it from afar, from 30,000 feet, as the political people say, you see that this is a major thing, and it's a great, huge challenge to the very basic fundamental structure of our human organization, and I think that it's harder than we anticipated. I think it's not that easy. So what you're seeing is this backlash, which has been building for a long time, especially, as you point out, at a time when there's a real challenge going on economically. I mean, people are feeling a whole lot of, when there's plenty to go around, people tend to be a little bit less intolerant,
Right.
And so, now that things are, the jobs that men held for, probably many of Rush Limbaugh's followers, good, well-paying blue-collar jobs, those are going away. And the jobs that are remaining are jobs that women are, very much in competition for, much less these guys having to work for women or having their own wives, working and feeling all that pressure. And yeah, it's not that I'm unsympathetic to it, but it is exactly, just because you're born as a white male, I'm sorry, that's not, should not always be a ticket to your superior position in society. And yet I think a lot of these guys are quite shocked by the fact that that's not the case anymore. And I think, I think that I look around the world and I see places like Iraq, for instance, where prior to the invasion, even under the monstrous, totalitarian state of Saddam, women were, operating as, far more as equals in that society than they are today.
I mean,
Now,
it is fascinating to note. I mean, in that story in the Daily Beast, that our nation ranks 71st in the world in female legislative
yeah,
representation, behind Bangladesh,
yep,
Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates.
yep.
I mean, that's pretty
I mean,
stunning.
that's shocking, I think. I mean, unbelievably shocking. And here we are, we're watching Rush Limbaugh, go on a sexist tirade that to me is unsurprising because I follow him pretty closely. And he's beyond sexist. I mean, the man is really a deviant, and
Right.
this is actually not that shocking. He usually is talking about feminazis and German shepherds and stuff. So this is right on par with what he normally says. It happened in the middle of a firestorm, and a constituency of women was already mobilized around a whole bunch of things that have just happened. Plan B and the Komen for the Cure thing, Planned Parenthood, Rick Santorum's comments about birth control. All that happened, and then Rush came in with his disgusting comments, and people noticed and have mobilized against him. But this is this particular aspect of anti-feminism or outright misogyny is actually nothing new. He's been out there doing this for a long time, keeping these people on
Right.
par, and as a result, look, we've got 17 or 6. We actually backslid. We had 17% representation until 2010. We now have less than we did, and when you see what happened during, women in politics, the stuff that they get, that is said about them is, men take a lot of hits too. I mean, I'm not suggesting that politics isn't a tough game, but it's of a different magnitude.
Well, I mean, why do you
comes to
think,
women.
though, this? I mean, a part of it is that I think there were already women activist groups, other activist groups who were sensitized to these issues because this has been in the news. But I really think that the story about Limbaugh is that there's been this type of pushback. I mean,
Yeah.
like you say, and I do think that, there is a difference, and not necessarily in how sort of grotesque it is, but in terms of the target between feminazi and calling a woman who's choosing to engage or who's talking about contraception as a slut. I mean, I think I think it's easier, like I'm just sort of like, imagining. My father's a fairly enlightened guy, but not that enlightened. And, I think that, I can imagine people of my father's age responding like, yeah, feminazi. But I think, the idea of, wait a second, I've always told my daughters not to, to sort of make sure you're protected. And now she's a slut because of that? Wait a second. There's no way, what needle is she supposed to thread here? I mean, I think there's he unleashed something, I think, that, because people are saying this is much to do about nothing, but the very fact that you now have 14 or 15 or more advertisers dropping out of supporting Limbaugh, the fact that you have lost a couple of stations, I think sort of runs completely contrary to that notion. It obviously is resonating with people in a way that something hasn't resonated in the past. And, the idea that this is just, there is, to the extent that there is a democratic or a leftist media complex machine that exposes Limbaugh, they've done nothing different this time than they did any other time. It's just that this one hit. And so I think that speaks to something of a heightened awareness by women, by people who believe that women are people, in our society that must exist.
Well, I think it's also, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. There is, this is a specific person for one thing. It's not an abstract sort of, caricature that he normally does with
Right.
this. So that helps. I mean, this woman,
And a
if you've seen
non-politician,
her, yeah, I
at
mean,
least until
she's an average, American woman speaking about an average issue that all women, I mean, 99% of women discuss, think about. I mean, this is nothing beyond the pale. There's nothing about her that seems specifically threatening or in any way odd. So I can see that being part of it, and it's also that it's birth control. I mean, those of us who've been following this, if you follow the religious right, a lot of their strategy has been leading toward this for a long time. I mean, they sort of fetishize the fetus as a way of kind of getting into this, but it was really always going back. It's beyond Roe versus Wade. It's to Griswold versus Connecticut. And, Rick Santorum said this, outright. He said this is, sex is supposed to be procreative,
Right.
the end, goodbye. And I think birth control has been bad for women. And he speaks for a lot of people of the religious right. I mean, they haven't been open about this, but, if you follow them, you can see that this is truly what they believe. And it has to do with the idea that women should be in traditional roles, period. And I don't think people knew that, and I don't think that most people understood that this was where this, accommodation with the religious right on abortion was heading. These are, you give them an inch and they'll take a mile people, and they do take a mile, and they always have. And here we are moving on a little bit to the next step, and started with the health care bill. And you could kind of see their forces sort of gathering there. So I think that this has been a big wake-up call for women in general who've been kind of, going along and kind of saying, well, people are funny, they're squishy about abortion. That's, nobody's comfortable with it. It's an unpleasant subject, and it's not something that, we believe in it, but I can see why other people have
Right.
a different view. Birth control, I think most people are going, whoa, wait a minute. What is wrong with that? What's wrong with it? Tell me what's wrong with it. And once you start hearing it, you either hear Rush Limbaugh saying, oh, all women who use birth control are sluts, or you hear the religious right saying, you shouldn't be outside the home. You should be at home procreating. That's
But
your
you see,
role in society.
I think the interesting thing about Limbaugh is that he has shrunk that divide because, like you say, Rush
Yeah.
Limbaugh has no religious bona fides. I mean, what he is attacking is the fact that women are empowered by birth control, by oral contraception in particular. They are specifically empowered by it. In the same way, and when we look at the disparity as to why there's less leadership roles for women in this country versus other Western nations, I don't think the level of consciousness in this country is such that people perceive something like daycare as empowering women in the workplace. I just don't think that people conceive of it that way. I don't think that people have been able to make that connection that oral contraception is also about empowering women in the workplace in terms of actually giving them full status in a country which up until never mind, didn't offer them the vote, but also used money and land holding as a means in which to disqualify people from participating in the political process. And I think, when a guy like Limbaugh comes out and does this, he lays it, I hate to use the word naked in the same sentence as Limbaugh, but he lays it bare. And
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. And I wonder if, I wonder if that to a certain extent, we're seeing more of this backlash against women than we were, let's say, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, as a function of having of race being slightly encumbered as a political tool by having a black president.
I think that's part of it. I really do. I mean, I think I think that decent people have been successful at ensuring worrying that in policing our society about open racism to some extent. I mean, it still exists, and we all know that there's a whole, underbelly of racism out there that still functions as a big part, certainly on the right. But we have been pretty successful at keeping that kind of public, open, degrading sort of rhetoric at bay, at least to some extent. I have to say that, I continue to be shocked by how casually people drop this kind of misogynistic talk and are then surprised when women are offended by it. I mean, this, if you go back to the 2008 campaign, and I was talking about this on my blog the other day, and not just about Hillary Clinton. I mean, this was true of stuff people said about Elizabeth Edwards, people said about Sarah Palin. I mean, there were plenty of women, Michelle Obama. I mean, look at the things that they're saying about her. I mean, it's just absolutely horrifying. And I mean, this is all, these are specific gendered insults that are completely acceptable in many circles, and not just, by the way, in conservative circles.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've seen it in liberal circles too. And, there's still a huge amount of leeway allowed to people to do this. Now, as I said, I mean, this is a massive social change, and it crosses all cultural, national, this is a global thing. I mean, it's not just America. We seem to be less willing to confront this than our European brethren, for instance, many of whom, certainly in the Scandinavian countries, have addressed this in a much more systemic way. But nonetheless, it's happening to some degree all over the world, and it's a big deal. But I think we've ignored the fact that it's a big deal, and I think we've reached now sort of a critical mass where we have to start talking about this a little bit. This stuff is very, very toxic, and it continues. It's why we're stuck at 16%. It is the reason that when Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House, Rush Limbaugh went on the air and said that she was so great she could clip her toenails and breastfeed on the floor of the House at the same time. This was the most powerful woman in American politics, and that is how he dealt with it. And his audience loved it. They were talking about how all of her, it was endless sexist discussions, and it's continued every minute of the day since then. Nancy Pelosi is a symbol to a large number of men of everything that they hate about women.
And I think that specific that specific attack, like for instance, I don't have as much problem with people saying one person is ugly or another person, because God knows I've made jokes about Mitch McConnell's looks, let's say. There's a certain amount of that takes place. But the idea that Nancy Pelosi, like, there is nothing about Nancy Pelosi that should make you say breastfeed and toe clippings. I mean, that has nothing to do with Nancy Pelosi. I mean, I am a professional sort of like comedic, insulter, and that has nothing to do with Nancy Pelosi.
I know. I mean, I could think of a million ways to, in a funny way to insult Nancy Pelosi, and certainly you can insult her politics. I mean, I'm not going to argue with Limbaugh's right to, put down San Francisco liberals. I'm not going to be happy about it, but I don't see that as being any kind of a sexist insult. This kind of stuff that he did, and he did on the day it was happening, he said something very, very explicit that day within that conversation about breastfeeding and all that. And this, I think, sometimes he blurts it out, and people don't understand what he said, but he's blurted out the truth, which is this is about the feminization of the culture. Uh-huh. And he was upset. Clearly upset. It's interesting. I don't know if people who are listening here, I mean, obviously, probably most of your audience does this, but, Media Matters has cataloged all this stuff for the last, since they started. And it's quite a collection if you ever want to go back and see. I don't think people realize just how pervasive it is and how constant. And it's not just him, it's the entire right-wing noise machine that does this, including, by the way, I shouldn't just attack men for this, because there are plenty of right-wing women who do the same thing.
Right.
I call them the sexist men and the women who love them. And, there's a whole industry built up, and this is a huge part of it, even among the Laura Ingrams and Ann Coulters and all these extremely strong women. I mean, these are not shrinking violets by any stretch. And they adopt all this stuff too, without a even a second thought, from what I can tell. I think they're right in there. I mean, Ann Coulter has said that women shouldn't have the right to vote. So, there you go.
I mean, I think in her case there's a decent argument, but just the concept of, people should just stop and think for a moment about the concept of the feminization of the culture. I mean, theoretically, right? Half the culture is
Right.
feminine. I mean, the idea of like the masculinization of our culture, one would never say that because that's the default. And again,
it's called patriarchy.
Right, and that speaks to, I think, the idea that the fact of the matter is that when women become equal members of our society, and when they're given the full rights, there's going to be a loss by men. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that this is being exploited. And even to the extent that, and I think it does to a certain extent, cross at least what we perceive on a surface level, some ideological levels. I always think of that moment when Chris Matthews, who, I think he perceives himself as a liberal. I don't know who it was. I think maybe it was Aaron Burnett, actually, where he was just like, she comes on.
Come closer, come closer.
Come closer, you're hot. What? You're on TV, dude. What are you doing? What are you doing? It was just, I just remember that moment of just like, he can't possibly think he's on, what? He's drunk. I mean, what's going on there? But I think to a certain extent, Rush Limbaugh has done this country a good service, at the very least, in ripping off the veneer that this is all about sort of, respecting people's religious values. This is more about, people just holding tight onto their place on the totem pole.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, this is something that's really important. Sarah Posner she follows the religious right and writes for RH Reality Check and various other great websites that follow women's issues and the religious right, and it's fascinating stuff for anybody who's interested in this topic, as everyone should be. And she, followed this thing called the Manhattan Declaration, which was a group of, religious right and other conservatives who got together in 2009 and came up with this religious liberty strategy. This isn't just something that kind of came up out of the blue. It's not a spontaneous thing at all. It's a deliberate strategy, and it's specifically designed to create carve-outs for conscience, which will in turn, in their view, create an opening to attack all of these, Supreme Court rulings and various things that, legalized women's rights and reproductive rights. And there's even some theories that this is going to lead to a larger strategy of conscience clauses being applied to all kinds of things outside of that realm, in which case, I don't feel like paying taxes for this, that, or the other, as a way of breaking down the federal government's ability to collect taxes to fund its business, generally speaking. Now, that's a very long-term strategy, but people should be aware that this is not something that, that is just sort of came up out of, a reaction, a spontaneous reaction. This is planned, and you see the Blunt Amendment that came through. Look how many Republicans voted for that.
Right.
That wasn't just a fringe. That was, a party line vote, basically. They had 3 dissenters on that. So this is something that's going to be coming back. They're not these people are not ones to run in and turn tail and give up on a strategy the way the Democrats do at the first sign of trouble. They will continue to come back at this. I know that they believe that they have a winning strategy. They take the long view and they will keep trying. So it's important to recognize this is really, really a big part of their long-term strategy. And maybe they're going to be defeated at the polls. Maybe people keep waiting for the illusory Republican establishment to step in and right the ship and make the party come back to reality. Maybe they can, but as far as I can tell, the Republican establishment at this point is the religious right and Rush Limbaugh and his people. And and a bunch of very wealthy guys who are willing to fund all that crap. People like the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and all these. They're so wealthy that they can afford to dabble in politics with millions and millions of dollars and basically change the course of history for their own discrete special interests, whatever those might be. In the case of those guys, it's ideological. Right. In others, maybe it's just purely a business deal. But regardless, I mean, this is going to be I don't see this going away. So I think that everybody should, you take your victory and then go on and, prepare yourself for the next fight, because it's not going to be over with Rush Limbaugh being taken off the air. Although, God willing, please, if that happens, it will be a victory worth having. This guy is a blight on body politic, and he is long overdue to be taken down.
From your mouth, Digby, to the flying spaghetti monster's ears. From the blog Hullabaloo at digby'sblog.blogspot.com. Digby, thanks so much for joining us.